go. So someone asked prior to us starting, I will send out the slides and the recording to all the participants after the workshop, so everyone will have access to everything afterwards. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll be talking today about how you can make your work open access and that it doesn't always have to cost money. This is part of our Open Access Week events. I always like to start with explaining who I am and what I do at McGill. So my name is Jessica Lang. I am the coordinator for scholarly communications. So I'm a librarian. My job, as I like to tell people, is sort of to be the on-campus publishing expert. So my job is to understand trends in publishing, to understand open access, how things are changing, to be able to, understand publisher policies, et cetera. So I'm essentially a campus resource person for any of you, related to any questions about open access, scholarly publishing, et cetera. So the goals of the workshop are to understand the main open access requirements of Canada's and Quebec's major funding agencies. We're going to look at the two primary ways you can make your work open access. And then I'm also going to talk about the library support services to support open access. Now, I believe we had a couple people joining today that may or may not be at McGill. If that's the case, that's fine. I am going to talk specifically to McGill resources, but in many cases, you're going to have the same resources available to you at your institution. We always like definitions. So open access is making literature digital, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. I'm going to focus primarily on the first half of that definition today, so making things free digitally, online, free of charge. Although the copyright and licensing restrictions, we're going to see come up a little bit when we talk about the FRQ's policy. So I imagine a lot of you here already you're here because you want to make your work open access, because as many people know, making your work open can have greater visibility for your research. It can reduce price barriers for accessing your research. It satisfies funding agency requirements. And so there's a lot of good reasons to make your work open access. Now in Canada, one of the major funding agencies is what we call the tri-agency. So that is SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR. So they have an open access policy. It states that peer-reviewed journal publications, so it doesn't apply to monographs or books, for example, it really applies to articles, must be freely accessible online within 12 months of publication. And I want to really underline that 12 months because that's going to come back later. It can be different versions of your manuscript can be made open, either the accepted manuscript or the publisher version. I'm also going to return to what that means, but just kind of park that in the back of your mind. It applies to grants awarded after May 1st, 2015. Often what happens, I give these workshops and then someone says, oh, I have an NSERC, I hadn't realized. And CIHR actually technically goes back to January 2008. So these policies have been enforced for several years now. So FRQ, the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, also has an open access policy. It's very similar to the tri-agency. Similarly, it applies to journal publications, once again, not to books, has a 12-month window, again, in which to make your work open. The FRQ launched its policy a little bit later in 2019. The one major difference is that it applies to student grants. So if you have an FRQ like student award, the FRQ open access policy applies to you. Now, going forward, this won't apply as of this moment, but if you submitted an FRQ application, say this fall, there will be a new policy coming into force this following summer, which requires immediate open access. So FRQ will get rid of the kind of 1-year window, and then they will apply an open license would be necessary as well. It's not a retroactive, so it's only going to apply to people who get grants, who are awarded grants essentially in spring 2023. Any questions to this point is what I call the preamble. So just general questions about the grant agencies, open access policies, or anything like that. All right, we shall continue. And at any point, feel free to pop questions in the chat and I'll come. I have bucketed in some question moments all throughout the workshop. So there are two primary ways to make your work open access. You can publish in an open access journal. This tends to be what people think about or seem to think as the primary means to make your work open. But there's another option, which is that you could publish in what we call a closed or a subscription journal and make a copy open via an open repository like McGill's eScholarship. I'm going to dive more deeply into both of those options. So the first one, as we mentioned, is publish in a quote gold or an open journal. So those are journals whose entire contents are freely open. So, you go to PLOS, doesn't matter if you're at McGill, if you have a subscription, everything in PLOS is open to anyone. It's a fully open access journal. There's lots of other examples. I'm sure you can think of some from your disciplines. I've just thrown up a couple, but these are all what we call fully open access journals. So in this case, as I mentioned, you go to the website, you go to the PDF, and boop, you get access, you can read it. You don't have to pay a fee or belong to a specific institution in order to read it. If you're curious to find gold open access journals in your discipline, there is a directory of open access journals you can use. I put the link to it there. As I mentioned, I'll send the slides out afterwards. So you can search in this directory, limit on your subject, etc. All that to say, I always tell people, you still have to use the same critical lens. So always review any journal you're interested in submitting to for, its editorial board, its scope, look at the different articles it publishes to make sure it meets certain levels of quality that you're interested in. Now, gold open access often though has what's called an article processing charge. So because, the journal isn't getting subscription revenue and there are some publishing costs, what journals have done or what this model has is that then authors, once they're accepted for publication, pay a fee. This fee is called an APC or an article processing charge. Just in case you're curious, these fees vary very, very, very widely. So you look at PLOS, I think that's actually should now be, I think it's up to $1,800 now, but around $1,700, $1,800 US. BMC, $3,600. Glossa, which is a linguistics journal, is obviously a lot cheaper. And then I should say there are some open access journals that don't charge fees at all. So I put the Canadian Journal of Regional Science in there. The journals that are open access that don't charge fees, these tend to happen more in the social sciences and humanities generally than in other disciplines, but you may be able to find some in your discipline. But just a note that they do exist. Now, if you look at this chart, you might ask why is PLOS, $1,800 and BMC's, almost $4,000? There's not really a good answer. The general consensus is that their journals charge what they are able to charge. Journals charge what they think they can get money for, particularly commercial journals. If you're curious to read more about, APCs and transparency, I've put some links below to some studies. But there's some evidence that no, it does not actually cost $4,000 necessarily to make your article open. There's a correlation in some cases that a journal that has a higher impact factor will have a higher APC, meaning they just think authors are more willing to pay. So that's just a note. But if you're curious to read more, I've put a couple articles below that might be of interest. Now, McGill does have article processing charge discounts. So McGill is part of a national consortium called CRKN. So when we go to subscribe to journals, we often are able to kind of get discounts on publishing open access with them. So I've put a couple of those up here just as an examples. And I put a link on this slide also to the full list of McGill's APC discounts. So these are ones where we get a discount. You get like a 15% or 20% off. We are more and more negotiating ones where we completely are able to cover the cost of publishing open access. So last January, we signed with Sage an agreement that allowed authors publishing with their what are called their choice journals. So Sage's choice journals are their closed journals. You can make your work open at no cost with those journals. There are like 7 or 8 exceptions, but that's pretty new, and that people have really been interested in that. And we also, as I mentioned, have a discount of 40% with their fully open access journals. Things that I need to really pay attention to, though, you have to be the corresponding author. So in a lot of cases, these discounts only apply to the corresponding author, and they're opt-in systems. So Usually what happens is when your article is accepted, you'll get sent an email saying would you like to opt into this open access agreement. I often find authors think it's spam or they delete it or they don't realize. We're trying to be more proactive in letting people know about these agreements, but it is opt-in. It won't happen automatically. And we've negotiated a couple other agreements like that. So Cambridge, this happened in January 2022. Similarly, it's corresponding authors again. It's also opt-in. And I believe it applies to almost all of Cambridge's journals. Once again, there are a few exceptions, but similarly, if you're the corresponding author and you've published with a Cambridge journal, you should get an email that asks, would you like to make your work open? And so that's something that's been negotiated. The other agreements we have that are like this is there's Company of Biologists is similar, as well as Carger. So these are a couple of agreements. We're adding more as we go along in negotiations, but I like to point these out because a lot of people aren't aware of them. All right. Any questions about what gold open access or any of the negotiated discounts or agreements we have? All right. I will continue on to the next model of open access. So that was what we call the gold route. You publish in an open access journal, potentially you pay a fee, and then the article is open alongside all the other articles in the journal. Now, the second model, which is often overlooked, but is considered, it's just as legitimate as the gold model, is called green open access. This is where you post a version to an open repository. And most people don't realize, but these are not random journals, but most journals allow you to do this. Now, there's often kind of caveats on when you can do it and kind of how, but most journals have what we call a self-archiving policy, or a policy that allows you to make a version open. So here's an example of what this would look like. So this is a journal article that was published in the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology. So this is what it looks like on the publisher's website. So if you were to go there, you would see, purchase PDF, and then it would ask you to pay $40 or whatever in order to access this article. This article has also been made open in McGill eScholarship. So if you came to McGill's eScholarship, you could download this article for free. The accepted manuscript version of the article is posted to eScholarship. So this would be this is kind of the green route. So a version of the article has been made open. People often wonder, okay, but how would someone find this free version of my paper? So eScholarship is pretty well indexed in what I call regular Google. So say someone had typed the title of your article into Google, you can see in this case, at least in my Google world, the eScholarship article comes to the very top. We're also in Google Scholar. The difference with Google Scholar, though, is Google Scholar sort of collects all the different versions of the article that might be out there. The top level link is the one that gets linked to the most. So usually by default, the top level link is the publisher website. But if you click under all versions, you can see here the fourth result is eScholarship. So that's how people could find the open copy. We're also in there's an open access browser plugin called On Paywall. So if someone was using that browser plugin to discover free content, they would come to the scholarship link, things like that. What I often tell people to do is if you say have a website or a listing of your articles, you put your citation up and then link to the free version of the article. That's what I do on my own website so that people come across, or if you have a student who's interested in working with you, the free versions of your paper are posted alongside, your citations on your website or your departmental homepage, etc. So this is a big question, but doesn't this violate copyright? The answer to that is no, but it's only permitted to do this for certain versions of your manuscript. Sometimes there's a delay before you can make an open copy. So they'll let you post an open repository, but not for 12 months or 24 months. So you always want to check your publishing agreement or check with someone like me. Now, I keep mentioning the version of your article. You're allowed to do certain things with certain versions of your article. So I want to talk about what those versions are. When you first go to submit to a journal, that article is called your preprint. So you've written your article, you've sent it off to a journal, that's your preprint. It's kind of considered the first version of your manuscript. While it's at the journal, it's going to go through peer review. You're going to make some changes. You're probably going to send it back, make more changes, etc. Finally, the article is going to be accepted. That's called the accepted manuscript. So the article has been accepted for publication, but it hasn't gone through typesetting, layout, copy editing. That's called the publisher version. You will have the most rights for the first two, for the preprint and the accepted manuscript. Typically, you're not allowed to do almost anything with the final publisher PDF. For the grant stuff we talked about at the beginning, so the tri-agency and the FRQ, you have to make open either the accepted manuscript version or the final publisher PDF. So many publishers are going to let you post to a repository the accepted manuscript version. So just that I really want to hammer this home, because I feel like this is one of the most important things I can tell you. A lot of authors don't realize they can do this. You need to save the accepted manuscript version of the paper yourself. Now, sometimes you can find this in the submission systems. Sometimes it's not perfect. I always tell people to act on acceptance. So when your article is accepted, that is the moment to find, to take that version of your manuscript, label it accepted manuscript or whatever, so that you know that that's the version. If your file formatting looks anything like mine, you often end up final, revision, revise, second time 2.0, etc. Label your accepted manuscript. Because this is the version that can typically be posted to repositories, and it's more or less the same content as the final publisher version. It just hasn't gone through that sort of a layout typesetting process. And the accepted manuscript can meet open access requirements. I often get a lot of questions about the accepted manuscript. They ask, is this the proof of your article? Typically, no, because the proof has been typeset, usually. So it's going to be the version prior to the proof stage. Is it a Word doc? Sometimes, yeah, it can definitely be a Word doc. It depends on how the publisher wanted you to submit your revised manuscript. But yeah, usually, and you'll sometimes have to liaise with your co-authors, right? So if you have several co-authors, you're going to have to liaise with them because maybe they're the ones submitting the revised manuscript to the system. And can you find it in the publisher system? Once again, sometimes. There is an online guide for how to go into the different publisher submission systems. And sometimes you can go poke around and find this version of your manuscript. So that's green open access or self-archiving in a nutshell. Are there questions about this method? See something in the chat. All right, so someone asks if our eScholarships versions are automatically synced with Google Scholar, or does sometimes it need to be done manually? So eScholarship is crawled by Google Scholar automatically. What sometimes happens, there is sometimes a lag because Google Scholar only runs its crawlers. I think they said when I wrote to them about this, like every 6 months. So sometimes there is a delay between when it goes into eScholarship and when it shows up in Google Scholar, but you shouldn't have to do sort of anything like on your end. Like it should just show up in Google Scholar. And someone asked, can we share the accepted manuscript versions on ResearchGate or academia.edu websites? This is a really good question. Unfortunately, a lot of publishers have clauses in their agreements that explicitly exclude what we call commercial use. So they say for your accepted manuscript, you're allowed to post it to an open repository so long as it's not commercial. And because ResearchGate and academia.edu are commercial entities, technically that isn't usually allowed. Now your preprint, that very initial submission could be posted, but the accepted manuscript, there's often an exclusion for commercial use. These are good questions. Are there any other questions about self-archiving or accepted manuscripts? All right, keep going. So I wanted to talk a little bit about McGill's repository eScholarship. As I mentioned, anyone who is joining us that's not from McGill, likely your institution has a repository and has similar services as well. So ask your librarian. So McGill's eScholarship is open and accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world. People sometimes seem to think that it's like locked only to McGill users, but that's not the case. So if you graduate from McGill, for students, for example, your theses and dissertations will also end up in McGill. Anyone can search it, download get at stuff. It's not like locked to McGill users only. Oops, I just accidentally clicked that. Okay. Anyone affiliated with McGill can deposit. That's the only requirement. So McGill students, staff, faculty, etc., can deposit with eScholarship. As I mentioned, it meets tri-agency and FRQ requirements, so long as I guess you're able to deposit in the right time frame, right? So if the journal says you can't deposit for 24 months, that's longer than the 12-month window permitted. But if you can deposit within 6 months or 12 months, putting it in eScholarship is going to meet those criteria. I've mentioned before, it's in Google and Google Scholar. In terms of deposit, we have an online deposit form. So you fill it out. You can upload multiple files if you have several accepted manuscripts. We always check the copyright permissions. We do that work for you. So if you send us something and we can't upload it, we'll let you know. Like, we'll check, and then we'll write you and say, oh, actually, this is the version we need, or, you know, do you have this? So we'll always check that for you. But if you've sent us something we can upload, we'll upload it right away. I'll also mention that we handle those embargo periods. So if you have, say I mentioned a 12-month delay, you don't have to hold on to your manuscript for 12 months and then try to remember in a year to send it to us. Send it to us immediately, and we have a way in our system to lock it so that it only releases after 12 months. So we handle that for you as well. We have other services for eScholarship. We do what I call an open access review. So say you've been publishing for a long time, you have a list of publications, and you might wonder, like, can I make any of these open? We'll go through and we'll see which can be made open and which versions are allowed to be made open. Typically, it's the accepted manuscript, but sometimes publishers surprise us. We can also do a journal policy analysis. So say you tend to always publish in the same 10 or 15 journals, and you're curious what their policies are and how do they align maybe with FRQ or tri-agency. We can do that. I've done that for a number of researchers. It can be really handy to have almost a table of, like, you know, these 15 journals and then kind of seeing their policy side by side. That's something else we can do. And as I mentioned, we take care of copyright permissions and handling embargoes and delay. So you're, of course, welcome to contact me. I've also put my colleague Jennifer's, she's the one that manages the day-to-day of eScholarship, either or if you have questions. I also like to tell people that if you're finding what I'm talking about today interesting and you think, oh, this would be great to have in my research group or in front of a departmental meeting or in a student association I run, I can give this presentation in any format, anywhere. So don't hesitate to contact me if this is something you'd like to see in other settings on campus. So yeah, we talked, we alluded a little bit to this. So people wonder if ResearchGate, Academia EDU are open repositories, and the answer is no. For two reasons. One is they're closed systems. So you do have to usually have a login to get at the content. So you have to give up personal details. So they're not open for that reason. They also don't have preservation mechanisms. So, you know, McGill's been around since 1821, and the library hopefully will continue to be there for, you know, more time, but ResearchGate could decide tomorrow to shut down. And so, you know, your copy would be lost. And as someone alluded to earlier, many agreements don't even permit posting to it. That's not to say don't use these sites. It's just, they're not good at this. They're not, you know, they're not built to be open access repositories. They're good for, you know, social media, connecting, and that kind of stuff. Similarly, if you do have a personal website, posting to your website would not meet open access requirements for similar reasons. Primarily, it's preservation. You know, if you don't pay your web hosting fee, your website goes down, you know, that open copy is now gone. Once again, that's not to say don't, you know, you can post versions to your website, but that's not a mechanism for meeting open access requirements. Now, sometimes people wonder about subject or preprint repositories. So in your discipline, you might have heard of different other repositories. Archive is one that's popular with physics. There's medRxiv now with medical, and bioRxiv with the biosciences. Anyway, there's more of these sort of repositories or preprint servers being launched. These can be really great for connecting with your discipline. So posting, you know, your preprint to there and seeing what else is out there. They can be good for quick dissemination of research. So a preprint server is kind of what it sounds like that first initial submission to your journal. Posting it to a preprint server means it kind of gets out there right away, because sometimes it can take a year or longer for your article to go through, peer review. And posting to a preprint server is typically permitted by most publishers, but you always want to check the publisher's policy before you submit. I see someone asking about Research Square. I'm aware of Research Square. Unfortunately, I'd have to double check its policies. I mean, that's not to say don't post there. I'd have to dig into it a little bit further. So I will make a note to look at Research Square. Thanks for that. Yeah. In terms of preprint servers, they are good for quick dissemination of research and connecting. It does vary if they're going to meet open access policies, because some do require login and some only allow the preprint because they're meant to be preprint servers by their name. So sometimes they don't allow you to update with the accepted manuscript. I've done kind of a quick table here. This is not an exhaustive list of preprint servers. It's just an example, but you can see here that Archive, for example, allows you to update and upload your accepted manuscript. So if you wanted to use Archive as your open repository for your accepted manuscript, that would meet tri-agency and FRQ criteria. I've put a couple other here, but then there are some like, BioArchive, which is really pitched itself for preprints only. That's its raison d'etre, like that's what it's to do. So it wouldn't serve that purpose. And then there's other ones like SSRN, which are open kind of, but sometimes also require a login. So once again, they're good for connecting with colleagues, but they may, they're not necessarily good for meeting open access requirements of grant agencies. A question you might have at this point is, well, how do I know the policies before I submit? It sounds like they vary. There's a really good tool called Sherpa Romeo. I'll go to it right now. Sherpa Romeo. Okay. I'm trying to make my screen a little bit bigger. Okay. So what you can do when you go to Sherpa Romeo is you can type in your journal. So I'm a librarian. Why don't I look at the Journal of Academic Librarianship? Okay, this one. Hit search. Okay. All right. So now I'm on the journals page. So it's telling me, who publishes the journal. This is an Elsevier journal. Then once again, this is important because it's going to tell you what you can do with the different versions of your paper. So there's different pathways, but if you want to make the published version of this journal open, you have to pay a fee. So maybe you think, I don't want to do that. You might think, what can I do with my accepted manuscript version? So for your accepted manuscript, you could post it to if you had a website, you could post it to your website immediately. So there's no embargo. You have to put on it what's called a certain Creative Commons license. And they want you to link back to the publisher version with a DOI. Okay, but what if I need to meet granting agency criteria, Jessica? You said posting to my website doesn't meet grant agency criteria. So we go down here. So in this case, if I wanted to post to eScholarship, I see that there is a 12-month embargo for non-commercial repositories, but that would meet tri-agency and FRQ requirements. And sort of similarly, have to link the DOI, et cetera. And if you're curious about they call submitted version, that's the preprint, no embargo, can post on any website, etc. The nice thing about Sherpa Romeo too is that they provide a lot of really good links at the bottom. So if you wanted to learn more about their sharing policy, or maybe you're co-authoring with someone from the UK and they might have a different list of embargoes for UK authors. What's nice is they provide these resources at the very bottom of the page. So this can be a really good resource if you want to check publish like a bunch of journals kind of at once. And as I said, I'm an on-campus resource for all of these things. So if you're ever confused or you're looking around and you can't seem to find it, you can always contact me and I'm happy to check their policies. Before I go into other FAQs, are there any questions about finding publisher policies in general, things like that? All right. So you might have some questions. I focused today on open access publications, not so much on data. This is changing. This landscape is also changing. Some journals now have data policies. So we do have data services to help researchers in this area. So I've put a link to our research data services website. So if you're interested or you've started to wonder about open data, you can go there and contact my colleague Elisa. I've also posted a link to our research data management guide. All right, and that is, I think, kind of everything I wanted to go over today. It's always a kind of a quick workshop. It's meant to kind of give you a real coverage of the land. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording, but if people have questions,